Good morning. Good morning, everyone. We'll give everyone just a minute to jump on here. All right, we'll give everybody just another minute to trickle in. How's everyone doing today?
Pretty good. It's starting to actually feel like New York is becoming springtime. I mean, it's chilly still, but it's like nice out. So there's that.
Yeah, London is very much rolling between rain and sunshine every 2 hours. So.
Lexi, shall we get started?
Yeah, I think so. I think people will probably trickle in here. We get going right on time today. All right, let's start. So welcome to Glossy's weekly LinkedIn Beauty Debrief. I'm Lexi Lebsack, West Coast correspondent here at Glossy, and I'm here with Emma Sandler, Glossy Beauty and Wellness Editor, Tatiana Pyle, our managing editor here at Glossy. Also welcomed today by Zofia Zeglinska, we're our international fashion reporter here at Glossy. Super excited to have you. Jill Manoff is going to be hanging out for a minute. And then we also have Courtney Marabella, Glossy's social media and audience manager. So I'm really excited to talk to everyone today and welcome you. We'll be discussing the rise of take-back programs. So we'll be diving into the power players in the space, the Gen Z and millennial values that I think are really particularly driving this industry, this, cottage industry, maybe even I can call it, how brands are utilizing take-back programs to reduce their environmental impact, but also really the unseen side of this and some of the challenges that we've found in our reporting and kind of have seen happening in the industry. Please stay tuned. We'll absolutely love to have any questions or comments and welcome you to our digital stage. We only have 30 minutes, so let's get right in. Just a little bit of context here. Take-back programs, as a lot of us I think know, are consumer-facing programs that brands and retailers can offer to encourage customers to somehow get their empty packaging back to the brand, whether that's dropping it off in store or mailing it in. As we know, most beauty products are needing to be commercially recycled outside of some single material bottles. Depending on your municipality, most beauty products need to be commercially recycled. And of course, we've all seen the sort of mind-numbing statistics about recycling rates. MIT said that it was between 5 and 6% of all plastic products were recycled last year, which I don't know about you guys and what you've heard, but this actually seems like kind of a high statistic based on statistics that have come out over the last few years, 5 to 6%, which is, a little bit sad to say. But when these programs first started, they were very, very different from what they are today. And I think that it was really driven by, a lack of consumer interest in this program. And of course, we know now that things have really dramatically changed. And I really want to kick us off here with kicking it to Sophia and some reporting that shows just how fast the industry has expanded. Sophia, your story from, I believe it was just last week, did so well touching on, the expansion of Ulta Beauty's Take Back program, which, of course, major power player here. Talk to us about sort of what you learned, what's fueling this, and what does this sort of look like for someone who potentially stops by an Ulta with their products?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me on. I know that, Ulta's probably one of the two biggest retailers in the US, not counting Sephora. So having a take back scheme there is a really big initiative. And from that article, I think that they're rolling it out to 1,350 US stores, so a big portion of their store footprint in the US. And in terms of how that's going to look like, it's basically a box, a cardboard box near the front of the store where consumers will be able to bring in their empties, and also, like, depending on how clean they are, they can kind of get all of that stuff in there. I think it ends up being recycled in a couple of different ways, so including mechanical recycling, which is where basically the item is shredded, molecular recycling, so it's either melted down and mixed in with something else, or just sent to the adequate kind of recycling facility. And it's quite an interesting topic, obviously, because beauty packaging in general is a very big topic. I think there's stats from 2022 that there's 120 billion units of packaging that are produced every year by the global cosmetics industry. And everyone knows that, you know, the amount of small jars and bottles that you have in your bathroom or elsewhere end up making quite a big portion of your recycling. And I think what Ulta's SVP of Enterprise Strategy and Transformation, Kristen Wolf, said was that most people don't know that those items can't really be recycled in curbside recycling. So you end up putting those things there, but they're not necessarily recycled at the end of it. So the expansion of this kind of beauty drop-off is a way that customers can bring in things which maybe are harder to recycle, which usually means something in, you know, different colored plastics, for example, would be quite difficult, or something in like a dark plastic would be really difficult to recycle. So they can drop them off in those store containers, and, you know, without necessarily getting anything in return, but just having something where they can deposit of that waste.
Yeah, I often think about the mixed materials that you see, whether it is, you know, this lovely, beautiful, like hard plastic, and you're like, okay, this is clearly not made from something that is a single source. You can kind of tell that, like, there's a lot going into it. Or I often think about the fact that with bottles where there's pumps, you can't really recycle the pump, even if you can recycle the bottle, because there's all these metal and plastic and different types of plastic in there. And so it's kind of a wash to try and recycle it. So I, for one, as a consumer, am very happy to hear of this. I have next to my vanity a bag where I put all my empty bottles and jars. So I look forward to, when that's filled up, being able to bring that to the Ulta or Sephora near me, because Sephora, to an extent, also has an in-store recycling program.
Emma, you're so right. Like that feeling that you have when you have like this beautiful piece of plastic that's like, maybe it's a face cream jar, or maybe it was like a compact or something, and you're done and you're just like, so I just throw it in the trash? Like, it's so beautiful.
Yeah, it looks untouched.
It's painful.
Yeah, and you're like, can I reuse this? And you become like whatever the packaging equivalent of a bag lady is, where you just like have a bunch of empty jars everywhere.
You know what I really hate is, like, I'm all about upcycling and using things again and finding ways to use them, but this like narrative over the last 10 years where people are like, just use it for something else, just put your, like, you know, buttons in it or something. But I'm like, how many times can you do that?
Yeah, I think I'm the same. I think it's literally only like really bougie packaging that ends up being like recycled. Like, I've got a bunch of Diptyque candle empties that are like got like cotton buds in it or something else, but it's very hard, I think, for beauty packaging to actually have a second life, unless it's, I don't know, like really nice glass or like something very kind of pretty. It doesn't really have that function as almost like a vanity object as maybe something else would, like, you know, a candle container. So it's very interesting to see that. And yeah, with Sephora, I think I covered that launch as well in terms of their take back program, which I think is called Repurposed, and they put it out to 600 stores. So it's smaller, but it's still very significant. And I think it's interesting in general how it shapes the kind of take back scheme in the US, which has probably, you know, got such a wide retailer footprint, but less of a take back initiative than maybe in Europe, where, all of the different regulations coming from Europe, and waste and sustainability regulations have kind of dictated that there has to be a little bit more of a stringency when it comes to approaching these issues.
Sophia, I wanted to ask you about sort of when you reported on this on Ulta and also reported on take back programs at Sephora, if you sort of heard from them about what their main goals were or what was sort of fueling this. But then also, I'm curious, do they have these take back boxes in Europe where you are?
Neither Sephora, until very, very recently, neither Sephora or Ulta actually are based in any way in the UK. We do have take back programs, I believe, in Boots, which is our kind of main beauty and cosmetics kind of retailer. And it is something that's quite prevalent. I think most of the times, though, because of the EU regulation, and again, the UK is no longer part of that, but that's something that's quite an important conversation still, is that majority of the plastics that are sold here have to be recyclable or in some way be able to be recycled through curbside. So it's almost a very different conversation than the one happening in the US.
Got it. And then when you were reporting on Ulta and Sephora, did they talk about sort of what their goal was for this program, or talk a little bit about what's driving it? It's obviously, even though they're two of our largest beauty retailers, of course they are a bit early in this. I have only ever seen these boxes at Nordstrom ever.
Yeah, I think they are really quite early, and it's a good thing that they are, just because of the fact that there is, so much kind of legislation coming down the pipeline in California around plastics and single-use plastics, which kind of suggests where it's going to go, in the future when it comes to other packaging. So I think in some ways, both Ulta and Sephora are, one, obviously getting a way of showcasing, an initiative that kind of pioneers sustainability within packaging in the beauty industry. But the second reason is, for Ulta especially, it seems like it's also a way to understand how brands can create more recyclable packaging. So knowing what comes in will then allow them to kind of create better things going forward. And then it also feeds into their kind of wider sustainability goals. So looking at kind of how those kind of responsible supply chains function within the beauty space.
That makes a lot of sense. So I want to take a second to just give a little bit of history on take-back programs. Not sure if any of my colleagues here sort of can recall some of these early programs. Curious if you do. But the first thing that I sort of remember is take-back programs originally were sort of being fueled by giving perks to consumers, and they were a lot more strict than they are now. So you would see Lush, MAC, Kiehl's, L'Occitane, basically incentivizing customers to bring in empty products, but they had to be products they purchased there. They had to be cleaned out. They were very specific about it. And you would get some sort of discount, or if you brought in enough, you could get a gratis product, for example. However, today, of course, a lot of these programs have been shifted, and now they take back empties, of course, but they've kind of taken away the incentivization there. But yeah, what do you guys think? Curious if any of my colleagues here, if you guys remember these early take back programs, if you have an initial response, if you had an initial response to them, and sort of what you think now. Do you think that consumers today will continue to embrace this? Obviously, we see Ulta going from, I think it was 90 boxes last year to, well over 1,000 boxes in stores. So what do we think? Do we think that consumers are going to be embracing this?
So it's interesting. I do remember, to your point, some of these earlier programs where there was that incentive. And I think ultimately that incentive was about trying to get customers to adapt or adopt a new behavior that they weren't otherwise familiar with. It wasn't always the case where we could go and get our perfume refilled, for example. And that's something that people just are not sure about, or that's something that they're not used to. I certainly, the few times I've gone through a perfume bottle, you have to check it in the trash. That's the only option. Or it's easier for people to just do that as opposed to actually schlepping into a store to go get it refilled, etc. And I think as people have become more familiar with this concept of either refilling something or recycling something, you no longer need to have that incentive to encourage adoption, but also these recycling programs are really expensive. And so I think, while they might, a store like Ulta or anyone else might want to offer an additional incentive, it just, unit economics don't make sense. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on it. We also have someone here who has been waiting patiently to speak. So adding them to the channel. Hi, is there someone there who wants to speak?
We'll give him a second. Emma, I think that is such a great call out. And I think it's a great segue into talking a little bit about sort of the companies that are behind this. So I know that Pact Collective, that's the one that Ulta is working with, right, Sophia?
Yeah, that's the main one. And I think that's the kind of the main one for the beauty industry in general, just because it's quite a common partner. Sephora's already partnered with them. I believe they have individual brand partnerships as well, with Fenty Beauty, Ilia. So I think it seems like quite a common use one. But there are others, of course, like TerraCycle.
Mm-hmm. So I know that, Emma, what you mentioned about the price, I think that's, can be definitely very tough for brands. I know that I did a little reporting last year, so this is, potentially like 6 months old, but Pact told me that they're structured into a membership. So you have dues that run between $850 and $12,500 for the year, depending on the size of the company. And then the programs are additional and quoted on sort of a case-by-case basis. But they are owned by Credo, and it is technically a nonprofit. So I think that they are, from what I've heard, and Sophia, curious if you heard anything about pricing during your reporting, but I heard that they are lower than TerraCycle, which, has been one of the ones that it's sort of like the OG, like they are behind the Nordstrom box, which was the first box I'd ever seen in a store before. And, part of some of these like early adopters.
Yeah, definitely. I think that they were a little bit reticent talking about the price, as it always is the case. But from what I understand, it does also run on that membership program, like you said. And it is something that brands are kind of partaking in, over a longer term partnership. They didn't mention kind of the details as to how long that partnership would be going on for. But I would expect that since this is kind of taking part of their sustainability commitments as a company, that this is something that they're going to be doing for a longer time. And it also shows that, if they've already started by rolling this out to more stores, that this looks like a longer term investment.
Yeah. And just taking a second here, if anyone here listening has any experience with a take back program, or if you've been quoted from a take back program, or have anything that you sort of want to add, please raise your hand. We'd love to have you talk a bit. Emma, I know you had experienced the TerraCycle as well. I think that you mentioned that you had inquired and it was very expensive to try to send something to go be recycled.
Oh, yes. This was a personal anecdote of mine, not entirely related to beauty. I recently had an incident where a wheel of my suitcase broke off, rendering it ultimately unusable for future travel. And as such, I hate the idea of just like chucking out, especially large objects. And so I wanted to look at either proper disposal or if there was some kind of recycling option available. So looking at TerraCycle, you are able to purchase these recycling boxes, fill it up with pretty much anything. And in the case of recycling this suitcase, the box, which didn't really make sense in terms of dimensions for the item that I was trying to recycle, but regardless, it was about $300. And that's a lot to swallow to recycle an individual item. And so, it was hard to make that decision.
I can't imagine paying $300 to have obviously you don't want to throw something in the trash, and we just talked about how terrible that feels, but it is prohibitively expensive, on most consumers. I looked yesterday to kind of see what the pricing is on TerraCycle right now, and if you were to just maybe you don't have a membership, and maybe you just have like an independent store, or maybe you just create a lot of beauty trash and you want to order a large box, which is 15 by 15 by 36. So it's a pretty big box, and can certainly hold years of someone's personal beauty products. I'm not sure, but it runs about $343 for them to send you the box and then for you to send it back. So it is quite expensive. I think that this is sort of like the $1 million question, though, that is sort of being kicked around right now, and curious what everyone thinks. But, it's like, whose responsibility is this? Because I think that obviously putting the onus on the consumer has not worked. But, the brands are also having to sort of swallow this large investment.
Yeah, I think the idea of putting the onus on the customer only goes so far, and is also a bit of a scapegoat. I mean, at the end of the day, like, I'm not in the decision-making realm of a particular company and the source materials that they decide to use. I'm not entirely convinced that it's so difficult and so hard to make a sustainable packaged item. I think the big issue is, like, how can we do that in a way that still speaks to the quality or loveliness of a brand? Obviously you don't want to buy like a La Mer item that's in like a cardboard box, but unfortunately I think collectively the world needs to adjust to our preferences of what's feasible versus what is actually attainable, or what's desirable versus what's actually attainable. So yeah, I think we are going to have to start using more paper products or more composite products made from renewable, resourceful materials. I'm not entirely convinced that it should be on me to figure out the end life stage of a particular product. Like, that's asking way too much of any single person.
I think that's a really interesting thing, because this is the discussion that's kind of happening in EU courts right now, is that, who does life cycle responsibility fall on when it comes to kind of consumer products. I think that for brands, there's this division basically that you're responsible for scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, which are basically like 3 different areas of sustainability, and manufacturing falls under scope 3, which would mean, packaging, both for beauty as well as kind of wider packaging. So thinking about, what your product comes in, whether that's, a special fill form, whether that's a cardboard box. And for brands, I think, for so long, I think they've been very removed from the other kind of parts of their supply chain, that now kind of putting that onus on them is a little bit more difficult. But I do think a lot of independent brands are actually thinking about this a lot. There's a company that I've got a membership to called Fern, which does, I think it's like a very specific perfume that they release 4 times a year. And their perfume comes in mushroom or like mycelium packaging, where basically you have a little fill box. It comes, posted to your door in a cardboard box. And it's still a very premium product and a very premium experience, but it does come in compostable packaging. So it means you can put it in, your back garden compost if you wanted to. And I think that might be a different proposition, where you're actually using sustainability almost as a marketing driver for your products. And I think that is something that, companies like Ulta could be looking to talk about with some of their brands, because obviously they've got a lot of partnerships and they do advise them on kind of what to do. I think that's to be something that they could be thinking about, as to kind of how to position those packaging options as almost more premium than what they're getting with plastic.
That's such a great point. And mushroom packaging, wow.
Yeah, it's really fun actually. Like, it doesn't smell like mushrooms or anything. It has a kind of slightly soft, like, touch. So it kind of feels a little bit more premium. And it definitely has, that additional aspect that I can chuck it and not be too worried about it going anywhere. And there's also, other options, like there's dissolvable plastics. There's obviously long-term kind of storage. I know that there's a couple of companies that are looking into making their packaging almost like a keepsake in other areas of the industry. So I think that could be something that beauty brands look at as well. But it's more about, what is the role of the retailer in this, and should they be part of that wider conversation? Obviously, I think yes, but that's just one person's opinion.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I think that, it can't just be the brand's responsibility, the retailer's responsibility until it reaches us. And it can't just be our responsibility until we're done with it either. But of course, it's like a much larger conversation. And Emma, that was an excellent point about the fact that you made about, we're not necessarily choosing to have our cream be in such thick plastic, in so many different materials, and make it, so difficult for us to recycle municipally. Which, I mean, like we could talk all day long about how challenging it is to recycle things on a municipal level. In California, for example, in LA, where I am, we don't even recycle glass. Like, you can't even put a glass bottle into a recycle bin right now because there just simply isn't a buyer for it right now, because of course recycling is a business, which again, I think why Pact, owned by Credo, nonprofit, is, sort of coming a little bit further. I would say they're sort of breaking away from the pack right now, and I'm assuming a lot of that has to do with price. But again, recycling is a business, and Sophia, that kind of takes us to our next point, which is show us or talk to us a little bit about what's going on in this industry right now, because obviously it's very hard to recycle all of these products. I know TerraCycle was in a little bit of hot water, right?
Yeah, this is my favorite part. So a lot of different recycling companies. So, for example, TerraCycle, which I believe in 2021, they were under an investigation and lawsuits as to whether their recycling was actually ending up in specific recycling areas or whether it was going to landfill. And a couple of different journalists placed tiny little trackers in different packaging that they had thrown out. That was supposed to be sent to TerraCycle, and after a couple of different locations where each of these items were sent to, I think some of them ended up in landfills, some of them ended up abroad, which basically means that they're untraceable, and then others, I think, very, very small portion were actually recycled into those streams. And I think that this is where that business kind of model aspect is really coming under questioning, just because a lot of these products are essentially downcycled. So even if you are recycling something, it doesn't mean that it stays in that same region where, for example, a piece of packaging will end up being recycled into a piece of packaging. Most likely it will end up recycling into something of worse quality, which will, go into construction or paving or something other, essentially. I think that that's where that issue kind of comes in as to, is this really the right kind of partnership for beauty brands? Should they be thinking about these things a lot more? Is it more of a kind of out of sight, out of mind mentality where as soon as it's gone from, their location, they're thinking, that's us, done, like that's good. Or does it require a little bit more digging? And I think that this is why, having sustainability kind of professionals within the company to evaluate these programs might be quite useful. Because I think in 2021, when some of their partners were spoken to, they didn't really do any extensive digging as to where those items ended up.
Oh, wow. I mean, it certainly feels like a relay race where, especially if you are a brand or a retailer and you're paying a good amount of money for a vendor to properly recycle your products, you would think that it would be done correctly. But I guess you're totally right in that all brands and retailers really do need to be doing due diligence and following the supply chain and checking in on it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, at the moment, there's no real kind of legislative push to do that. So I think a lot of the times, for the beauty industry, for example, it can kind of go on doing what it's been doing for the last, 10, 20 years. But I do think there will be more of a input into, what these things are doing. There's a lot of plastics that end up leaking materials or PFAS into like skin, into waterways. So I think that it can be something that is quite negative for health overall. I think there will be a move away from those types of packaging for other reasons other than just, for sustainability and the packaging aspect.